Recently, someone sent me a clip asking me to do another video on Dennis Prager. Prager had already been on my radar for a number of things that he said about religion or against science, but now I get to listen to his irrational demonization of the left. So this video will talk about politics. I can't avoid it. Since I announced my candidacy to run for Texas State Senate in a heavily right-wing religious Republican district, I kind of have to deal with slurs like this.
I can agree with a liberal. I can't agree with a leftist. I make the distinction between liberal and left constantly because it needs to be made. The left is an enemy of liberalism, and I love liberalism. I'm called a conservative, but the irony is I don't know pretty much of any value that I changed since I was a liberal.
This is the most accepted depiction of the political compass, at least here in the U.S. The colors and categories may be different in Europe or Australia. It's not a perfect chart, to be sure. I mean, don't ask me why activist is in the middle or moderate position economically. I think we're using different definitions since activists, to my experience, tend to be on the extremes. These extremes represent degrees of balance between capitalism and socialism, horizontally and vertically between authoritarianism and anarchy. And notice that liberalism is shown on the axis, dead center of the compass. Seems that the libtards are actually moderates, as moderate as you can get. But let's say you were a liberal since way back and you never changed. Over the course of our lives, both Republicans and Democrats have shifted further and further to the right. That's the Bushes, the Clintons, Obama, and Trump. They're all on the right, so that the liberals are now on the left relative to everyone else. And that's why every liberal I've ever met identifies as a leftist, and everyone who hates liberals complains that they're leftists. Likewise, progressivism is shown here on the right, referring to the progressive era of the early 20th century. But those who identify as progressive today, myself included, are actually on the left, along with at least half of America's working people, by the way. Both liberal and progressive are contested concepts, but I think modern progressives have a different definition than the progressive movement from a century ago, and so this chart should probably be updated accordingly.
I knew I was not on the left when during the Vietnam War, which I was in college, and I knew communism was evil, and my life is devoted to fighting evil. That's what I care about more than anything. I hate people who hurt people deliberately. I hate them. I want them destroyed. I want evil destroyed.
So do you want to destroy them deliberately? Or because you hate people who hurt people deliberately, do you want to destroy them and make it look like an accident?
I have not wavered in that passion since high school. That's all I care about a million things, but that's my greatest care. I want to destroy evil. Nazism, communism, Islamism, you name it. And the left didn't. The left hated Nazis, but they didn't hate communists. So it meant they didn't hate evil. And that's my first realization that I wasn't on the left.
So we both see Nazis as hateful racists and therefore evil. And they're exclusively right-wing, by the way. Their party once had the word socialist in their name, but they're not actually socialists. They're fascists. Fascists are on the right. Racism is sometimes classified on right wing too. Communists and socialists, which are not the same thing, are on the left, the very far left. You can be on the left and not be a communist or socialist. I happen to know a communist once. She grew up in the Soviet Union and believed that communism was a political ideal of mutual cooperation for the benefit of all mankind. And she knows it didn't work out that way, but she didn't think it was evil. And she wasn't evil either. But then, communism isn't based on hatred, like Nazism is. Now, if some educated political science major in college understands the difference between communism as a political ideal and its consistent failure in every application in corrupt human society, then you think that student doesn't hate evil just because he understands it better than you do? I understand that distinction, and I'm on the left, and I hate evil too. Well, I don't really hate anything, but I do object to evil. I'm just better reasoned at it than you are, looking at specifics instead of prejudiced generalizations. I also define evil differently than you do. It's not just anyone who thinks differently than me. Evil is lies and violence, selfishness, cruelty, and apathy, taking advantage of others to their detriment and against their preference. You Dennis Prager, are evil whenever you spread misinformation, misleading people with your deceptive videos. For example,
secular humanism devalues the worth of humans.
that was a lie, Mr. Prager, and we're going to talk about that real soon, but not in this video. Unlike you, I do not judge people by deciding to hate anyone who doesn't hate the same things that I hate. There's a lot of hate in you, and since I don't have that and wouldn't trust it if I did, then I need data to determine my political alignment. And people have always accused me of being a leftist all my life, probably because I was never a bigoted dick to people like right-wingers typically are, and as you have just demonstrated. But I didn't really know where I am on the political compass until I took a test to find out. I don't know how reliable that is, but how else would I know? How can I find out? So I took a few different ones and compared them. I'll include the links below if you want to try it yourself. All of them had different questions, and they all put me right about here, where Noam Chomsky is. You know, that enemy of liberalism? That's not the middle. That's left of center. So regardless what irrational prejudice anyone has against the left, I have to say that I'm on the left because that's what the test indicates. But notice that it's not all the way on the extreme left. When I took these tests, I didn't know where I'd end up. I mean, I didn't think I'd quite be socialist, but I do think that we should have at least as much access to health care as any other country, since we are the only developed nation that doesn't offer that to all of our citizens as a right, and it's kind of embarrassing to be behind other countries in something like that. Instead, we have runaway capitalism here, which is why Americans pay more for prescriptions than other countries too. But while one of these tests said that I lean socialist on some issues, none of them said that I was socialist, because I lean capitalist on other things, just like everyone else does. But you know what none of these tests ever said? They never said I was an enemy of liberalism. And you know why they didn't say that? Because I'm not. Because you're full of shit.
So, but I still thought I was a liberal, but not on the left. And then Ronald Reagan came, and in one sentence, it all turned for me. And then I became a Republican. And that was, government is not the solution, it's the problem.
Now, that was certainly true in Reagan's day, and it's never been more true than it is right now. But that's also why you shouldn't be a Republican, isn't it?
And that was an epiphany. And I thought, that's right. There are truths that are so real that if you have an open mind, it doesn't take more than 5 seconds to realize it.
And then there are faulty conclusions like this that you shouldn't have jumped to. It's an unsupported assumption that you should have questioned at some point since then, but somehow you never did. I remind you of what Noam Chomsky, that other lefty like me, had to say about that. There is only one party in the United States, the Property Party, and it has two right wings, Republicans and Democrats. So if you want to get away from the corporatists, vote left. Being opposed to corporatism, as Thomas Jefferson was also, forces me to be on the left, on the side of the people instead of the side of the banks and corporations and plutocrats. Being on the left doesn't mean we're evil. It doesn't mean we're enemies of anyone. It means that we care more about society as a whole than we do about the wealthy elite or contributing to the power of corporations who are trying to supplant our democratic republic with a plutocratic oligarchy.
But the home for classical liberalism is the Republican Party, to the extent that they're not big government people, which George W. Bush was, for example. But the only home between Democrats and Republicans for limited government people is the Republican Party.
Except that I meet the definition of classical liberalism, even according to Conservapedia. But I'm nowhere near Republican. I'm on the left. And here I am pointing out that I actually want less government than the folks on the right. Because now you've switched axes. Now you're not talking about the left versus right anymore. Now you're talking about authoritarians versus anti-authoritarians. I don't mean libertarianism. That's listed here as an exclusively right-wing political party. I'm talking about the half of the political spectrum that is opposed to authoritarian regimes like the last several presidents have all been. How are you going to achieve less government if you only vote for right-wing authoritarians who want to govern absolutely everything, even what happens in your bedroom or who you are allowed to marry? My wife, for example, is half Vietnamese. In the 1960s, when I was a little boy, the marriage I have now would have been illegal because people on the right took that right away because that's what they do. And the people on the left had to give us back that right because that's what we do. And notice that the Republican Party doesn't own the right wing. I should also mention that only a minority of them match your description. There is no between the Republicans and Democrats either. The establishment elite of both parties are on the same side, the quadrant for more government, not less. Whereas I suspect most Democrats, at least the New Democrats, the Justice Democrats certainly, and nearly all of the independents of every stripe are on the side wanting less government. Or at least most of them are on the left. But it's interesting that you said that you can't agree with someone on the left. Yet you and I agree that we both want to destroy evil, and we both want less government than we have, less government than you voted for.
I was as anti-Trump as anyone, but I wrote from my first column, if he wins the nomination, I will vote for him. And my thinking was clear, and in retrospect was clear. I kept giving this analogy. If you have two doors, over one door it says man-eating lion, and over the other it says maybe a man-eating lion, I will open the maybe a man-eating lion door.
But that's not what you did. Exactly the opposite happened. You voted for the man-eating lion, the one candidate of the four who actually promised to take people's rights away and ruin everything for everybody. You didn't want to vote for Hillary because of your irrational hatred and misunderstanding of the left, but she's at least as far right as Trump is. She's essentially a moderate Republican. So out of blind fear of what you thought was the left, you overlooked the only qualified candidate and elected a fascist instead, the very thing you said you hate. You're supposed to destroy fascism, not equip it with tyrannical power and nuclear weapons.
Defeating the left is as great a moral urgency as defeating Islamism. Those are the two enemies of Western civilization as we know it.
The greatest threat to Western civilization got your vote and is now in the Oval Office signing executive orders to destroy the environment, the economy, and education, reversing progress everywhere, ruining everything for everyone, and even provoking China. You've elected a narcissistic, incompetent madman. Good job.
But I mean it sincerely. Look at what they're doing to the university. The university is now becoming a fascistic place, literally. With the quasi-violent suppression of dissenting voices. And the reason, it is the only place the left runs without opposition. So when the left is free to do what it wants, just look at your local university and you see what's happening.
I don't know what your experience with universities is. Is it that you can't defend your position very well? That's what I would suspect. I don't know. I mean, I know there are some extreme leftists in universities at the moment that I have conflicts with too, because the world is more complicated than black or white, left or right. But you're saying that when you allow the left to do what it wants, that they'll become fascists? That the extreme left will suddenly flip to become the extreme right? Remember Noam Chomsky, right where I am in the political spectrum? He said that if we don't believe in freedom of expression for people we despise, we don't believe in it at all. I agree with that. And so does every leftist I know. So when you spread your prejudice with generalizations like you just did, you have to remember people like me and him, because your pejoratives do not apply to the majority of people beneath your broad brush.
The left does not divide the world between good and bad. I do. But the left doesn't. The left divides it between rich and poor, and strong and weak, or victim and victimizer. So you don't get your strength from being right. You get your strength from being a victim.
I've always been on the left, yet as far as I know, I've never been a victim. Never felt like one anyway. All my strength comes from being right, as in getting my facts straight so that I'm correct. It's a good way to be. You should try it sometime. But you hate the left because you think they don't judge people according to the same false dichotomies as you do? The first problem with that is that it's not true, I'm sorry to say. There are those on the left, just as there are plenty on the right, who will dismiss every potential ally over one difference of opinion, even if it's irrelevant to the issue at hand. And the problem with that is the problem you have. It's a character flaw. Nobody is good or bad. Everyone is milling about somewhere in the middle. You see, I believe in the bell curve, where the vast majority are somewhere between these extremes, and that it is virtually impossible to be on either one extreme or the other. And don't put them into an either-or box when it's not a dichotomy. Every capitalist believes in social programs, and every socialist is happy with trade based on currency. If you think that some form of government is necessary or has some job to do for its citizens, that doesn't mean that you worship the state. And if you say you want less government, it doesn't mean you want anarchy. We all want a balance somewhere between these four, so stop looking only at the opposite extremes because it's not that simple. And likewise, before anybody brings it up, feminists often admit to having some sexist attitudes, and anti-feminists endorse some degree of gender equality because no one is completely one side or the other. So these are not dichotomies, as I've said so many times before. They're extremes, and we exist in a balance between them. The dividing line actually runs through the middle, where most of us are gathered pretty close together.
By the way, one of the things, because I studied leftism, that was my, I studied communist affairs, Marx, leftism, and one of the things that they have always excelled at is one-word dismissals of their ideological enemies. So Stalin called Trotsky, the father of Bolshevism, he called him a fascist. Mm-hmm. So Trotsky was a fascist. There was no need to debate Trotsky. You call him a fascist and then have him killed with an ice pick. That's in a nutshell what the left does.
But that's what you just did.
Look at what they're doing to the university. The university is now becoming a fascistic place, literally.
You're such a hypocrite, Mr. Prager. You called the left fascists and evil and the greatest threat to Western civilization. And as if that wasn't ironic enough, you also judged them for their bigotry. What about your bigotry and the fact that you judged us falsely?
I've never met somebody on the right who said the science is wrong.
Have you ever met anyone on the right? Have you met Donald Trump? Or Mike Pence? Have you met anyone in that administration? Or any of the right-wing legislators in my state? Or in any state? Have you met yourself, Mr. Prager?
So evolution is a very complex issue, believe it or not. Now, by the way, I don't have a particular axe to grind. I happen to believe in God, and my position for most of my life was, okay, God created evolution. I have no issue. But it's not my position any longer because I simply know more science. And the science on evolution is not nearly as established as people think it is. Because the paleontologists themselves are not so certain that it occurred in anywhere near the way they believe it did.
I know a few paleontologists, and what you just said is completely false, and I can list paleontologists who will say so. If this were a two-way conversation, I would call you out for a paleontologist who agrees with your statement. And if you dared name someone, I would find that person and then find out that he didn't agree with you at all.
Two quick things on that. Sure. One is, of course, it just needs to be stated that evolution has zero explanation, I mean zero, none, for the creation of life.
Because that is not evolution, that's abiogenesis, an overlapping array of different processes, and descent with inherent genetic modification obviously can't be prevalent among them.
There was no evolutionary jump between inorganic and organic. And they acknowledge that. They just say one day they'll find one, but there isn't one.
The origin of life was always a matter of organic chemistry, of complex carbon chains. It was never inorganic.
So the evolutionist has nothing to say about the origin of life.
Wrong again, as always. What we can say is that we know a whole lot more about it than you're aware of or would likely admit. I made a classroom supplement video to explain it to middle schoolers. You should watch that and see that we do have quite a good explanation, actually. I'll include the link below.
Mm-hmm. The second part is they don't have a lot to say even on the origin of species. When you look at, there was this thing called the Cambrian, explosion, that's it, explosion.
Okay. Yeah.
This was when vast numbers of species arose, but much too quickly for evolution to have accounted for them.
You're talking about a period of about 50 million years, beginning roughly 541 million years ago, which only produced the very earliest, simplest, and most primitive representatives of 20 of the major animal phyla, where there were very few multicellular forms or fossils before that. The Cambrian was a problem in Darwin's time right up until a couple of decades ago. Since then, fossils from the Vendian period, just prior to the Cambrian, have been shown to include precursors of some Cambrian fauna. The other phyla appeared later on, and most of these species were already extinct by the end of that first period of the Paleozoic era. How's that for intelligent design? The first multicellular animals had no skeletons or organs or sensory systems of any kind. The first drafts of these began to develop apparently experimentally, trying out every direction at once. And many of these early experiments were unsuccessful because there were more phyla to emerge in that era than we have left today. And some of the earliest forms were so bizarre that we can't even make sense of them because they're so alien and incomparable to anything still around. Then, as with early designs of airplanes and automobiles, once other possibilities were explored, the more functional lines continued to diversify, while less practical derivations thinned into extinction. And a few of these basic designs that worked well enough are still out there and have since diverged into many new orders of life that did not yet exist in the Cambrian. So there is no problem for science to explain in the Cambrian explosion.
And there were so many qualified scientists who have taken this on. Even the famous Harvard paleontologist who's passed away, whose name eludes me for the moment, but he wrote about this. He was an atheist or an agnostic, but he said he had punctuated evolution, which is almost an oxymoron.
That's punctuated equilibrium. And Stephen Jay Gould wasn't talking about the Cambrian explosion. He was talking about why dramatic change was not constant. You have constant variation in forms of genetic drift, but major morphological changes are apparently driven by environmental dynamics. Thus, transitional species, like the lineage of early tetrapods, represent relatively few species that left the water to then proliferate into millions of species that were better adapted to the land and therefore no longer appeared to us to be transitional. So, you changed your mind about evolution after you learned more science? If this is all you know, and all of it is wrong, then what could you have known before?
My only point is that it's not as clear as they make now.
Yes, it certainly is. First, this from the National Center for Science Education. Evolution is a vital, well-supported, unifying principle of biological sciences, and the scientific evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of the idea that all living things share a common ancestry. Although there are legitimate debates on the patterns and processes of evolution, there is no serious scientific doubt that evolution occurred or that natural selection is a major mechanism in its occurrence. And this from the National Academy of Science. Evolution is a fact because the theory of evolution is supported by so many observations and confirming experiments that scientists are confident that the basic components of the theory will not be overturned by new evidence. Evolution really is as clear as they make it out, Mr. Prager.
Mm-hmm. So if you happen to believe that God created the world, which I don't, because the science negates it.
Yeah.
But if you believe, and I believe that the Bible is divine and all that good stuff, but nevertheless, if you do believe that, I don't give a hoot if somebody believes God created the world in 60, 24-hour periods. I care if they reject vaccines, if they don't give blood transfusions. Mm-hmm. In other words, I don't care what people believe.
Yeah.
I care how people behave.
I care what people believe because beliefs inform actions, and only accurate information has practical application. Because people don't just deny medical science, they deny anthropogenic climate change too, as if there was any possibility that industrial nations are not having a cumulative negative effect on the atmosphere that can be measured and confirmed.
Truth is truth.
Yeah.
God, there's a Hebrew saying, the signature of God is truth. If something is true, I must believe it because it's true. I am religiously obligated to believe it if it's true.
I'm going to hold you to that. We know evolution happens and has happened, and that it happened very much the way paleontologists described and that geneticists can now confirm. If I haven't changed your mind about that yet, call me. I'll prove evolution to your satisfaction and then wait for your retraction. But I've seen a few of your videos, and they're mostly demonstrably factually false. Remember this one?
No document in world history so changed the world for the better, as did the Ten Commandments.
If you haven't seen my rebuttal to your video, the link is below.
And here is a theory. So here's my theory. The human being clearly needs to believe some non-rational things. I believe that that is part of what the human mind must have.
Although I do have the odd irrational thought once in a while, it is quickly put out and replaced with a reasonable one. I do not have any need or desire to believe in irrational things, but thank you for admitting that belief in God is irrational. If you'd said so a couple of years ago, you could have saved me the trouble of having to make this video.
Many people think that faith and reason are opposites, that belief in God and tough-minded logical reasoning are like oil and water. They are wrong. Belief in God is far more rational than atheism.
No, sir, you are wrong.
How you fight the irrational is very hard. It's very hard because you can give evidence, and it doesn't convince people if people have a vested interest in believing something, you can't talk them out of it. And this is why I fear the left.
No, that's why I have good reason to fear the right. Because just in the last few years, right-wing Republicans have done all they can to politicize the classroom, undermining education in science, sex, and social studies, allowing teachers to promote their religion and teach uncritical thinking, while right-wing legislators tried to disable public schools altogether, with some suggesting that poor children should not even have public schools to go to, but instead should return to the workforce. Right-wing Republicans have tried to hasten overpopulation, consumption of our resources, and the destruction of the environment and endangered species, while trying to establish an American theocracy and legalize hate crimes, depriving people of their rights, discriminating on the basis of religion, sex, and sexual orientation, enabling child abuse and excusing child molestation while justifying slavery and violating every provision of the First Amendment. You don't see this happening on the left. The most criminally immoral political insanity typically comes almost exclusively from the right.
But when people drop Judeo-Christian religions, Catholicism, Protestantism, Evangelicalism, Mormonism, Judaism, when people drop those, they don't stop yearning for religious certitude. So what they end up with is secular religious certitudes, and they are at least as scary.
This gross generalization doesn't apply to me either. I was raised Christian and I was conditioned to accept unsupported conclusions uncritically, but even then, I didn't want or need certitude, religious or otherwise. So unlike you, I do not believe irrational things. And unlike you, I try my very best not to assert as fact things that are not evidently true, or worse, that are demonstrably false.
It's time to be positively rebellious and rebelliously positive. As long as we stand up for what we believe in, don't give in to anger or violence. Look out for the little guy. Keep an eye on the big guys. Refuse to keep our mouths shut. And just generally try not to be dicks.